On a high plateau in what is now eastern Turkey, at the edge of a deep river gorge that marks the border with Armenia, there is a city that the wind has been working on for 9 centuries. The walls are still standing, or most of them are. They rise from the plateau edge in a long curved line, their stone towers still recognizable as towers, their gateways still framing the absence of the gates that once hung in them. Inside the walls, which enclose an area of roughly 5 square kilometers, there are churches. There are the ruins of a palace. There are the remains of a great mosque. There are the foundations and the collapsed arches of a cathedral that was, in the century when it was built, one of the largest Christian churches in the world. And between these monuments, stretching across the open plateau in all directions, there is nothing. Grass and thorn and the occasional wildflower and the sound of the wind moving across a landscape from which everything that was not built in stone has long since disappeared. The city is Ani. Its name appears in the historical records of the medieval world in contexts that make clear it was understood, by those who knew it, as one of the great capitals of the age. Arab geographers described it. Byzantine chroniclers noted its power and its wealth. Armenian historians recorded its founding and its flourishing and its successive catastrophes in a prose that moves between pride and grief with the particular cadence of writing about a civilization that knows itself to be both exceptional and vulnerable. At its height, in the late 10th and early 11th centuries, Ani was the capital of the Baghdad Armenian kingdom, a state that had extended its power across much of what is now eastern Turkey and the South Caucasus, and the city itself may have held as many as 100,000 people, a figure that would have made it one of the largest cities in the medieval world. And then, in the space of roughly 2 centuries, Ani passed through the hands of the Seljuk Turks, the Georgians, the Mongols, and a succession of smaller regional powers, each of whom left their mark on the city in the form of construction or destruction or both, until the final abandonment in the 14th century left the plateau empty and the city to the slow attention of the wind and the rain and the progressive failure of the mortar that held the stones together. By the time European travelers began to describe the site in the 19th century, the city had been empty for 500 years, and the only inhabitants of the plateau were the animals that grazed on the grass between the ruins and the birds that nested in the empty towers. What survives at Ani is, even in its ruined state, extraordinary. The Cathedral of the Holy Apostles, the Mosque of Manichaer, the Church of the Redeemer, the Church of St. Gregory of the Tigranids, the palace complex on the northern edge of the plateau. These are not the anonymous foundations of a vanished settlement, but the standing walls and the soaring arches of a medieval architecture that was, in its day, the expression of a sophisticated and self-conscious civilization's highest ambitions. Understanding what Ani was, and what happened to it, requires understanding the civilization that built it and the particular position that city occupied in the history of the medieval world. The plateau of Ani sits at approximately 1,500 meters above sea level in the volcanic highlands of eastern Anatolia, a landscape of immense visual drama and considerable historical importance that has been shaped by geology and by the successive passage of every major power that ever moved through this part of the world. The plateau itself is defined on 3 sides by the deep gorges of 2 rivers, the Akurian to the west and north, which now forms the border between Turkey and Armenia, and a smaller river to the east. These natural defenses, combined with the relatively flat and open terrain of the plateau top, made the site an obvious choice for a fortified settlement from very early in human history, and the archaeological evidence for occupation at Ani stretches back long before the medieval period to the Bronze Age and beyond. The natural topography that made Ani defensible also made it visible. The city on the plateau could be seen from a great distance in every direction, and the sight of its walls and towers on the horizon announced its presence and its power to anyone approaching across the surrounding landscape. The geology of the region is dominated by the products of the volcanic activity that has shaped the highlands of eastern Anatolia over millions of years. The stone most commonly used in the construction of Ani's monuments is a volcanic tuff, similar in many respects to the tufa of Cappadocia, soft enough to be worked with the tools available to medieval builders, but durable enough to hold the detailed carved ornament that is one of the distinguishing characteristics of Armenian medieval architecture. The coloring of this stone, which ranges from pale cream to deep orange-red depending on its iron content and the specific quarry from which it was taken, gives the ruins of Ani a visual character that is unlike anything in the Western medieval architectural tradition. Warm and deeply saturated, the colors of the surviving walls and arches shifting as the light changes across the day and the season. The climate of the plateau is harsh by any standard. The winters are long and extremely cold, with heavy snowfall that closes the surrounding mountain passes for months at a time. The summers are short, hot, and dry. The spring and autumn, when the plateau is briefly green and the wildflowers are in bloom between the ruins, are the periods that most closely correspond to what the medieval city might have looked like in its functioning years. The combination of extreme cold in winter and intense heat and dryness in summer, repeated over 9 centuries since the city was last inhabited, has been the primary agent of the physical deterioration that has reduced many of the standing structures from complete buildings to the partial walls and isolated arches that characterize the site today. The strategic position of the Ani Plateau within the wider geography of the medieval Near East was its most important characteristic from the perspective of the powers that competed for it. The plateau sits at the junction of the routes that connect the Black Sea coast of Anatolia with the Caucasus and the Iranian Plateau, and that connect the Armenian highlands with the Anatolian Plateau to the west and the lowlands of northern Syria and Mesopotamia to the south. Any power that controlled Ani controlled access to all of these routes, and the city's successive conquerors and rulers were all motivated at least in part by the desire to hold this strategic junction. The Armenian kingdom that built Ani into a great capital was the Baghdad dynasty, whose history stretches back to the 9th century and whose period of greatest power coincided with the construction of the major monuments that define the archaeological landscape of the site today. The Baghdad dynasty emerged as the dominant power in the Armenian highlands in the period following the decline of the Arab Caliphate's direct control over the region in the 9th century. The Caliphate had conquered much of the Armenian highlands in the 7th and 8th centuries, and the region had been administered as a subordinate territory of the Islamic world during that period. But as the central authority of the Caliphate weakened in the 9th century, the Armenian nobles who had maintained their local power under Arab overlordship began to reassert their independence. The Baghdadids, who traced their lineage to a noble family with ancient roots in the Armenian highlands, were the most successful of these reasserting powers, and by the late 9th and early 10th centuries they had established a kingdom that controlled most of what is now northeastern Turkey and the southern Caucasus. The decision to make Ani the capital of the Baghdad kingdom was made by King Ashot III in 961, and it was a choice that transformed the city from a regional fortified town into the showpiece capital of a kingdom that aspired to be recognized as one of the great powers of the medieval world. The building programs that followed this decision, conducted by Ashot III and by his successors Smbat II, Gagik I, and their immediate heirs, produced the cathedral, the palace, the city walls in their current form, and the first of the many churches that characterize the site. The scale of investment that these building programs represented was enormous by the standards of the time and the place, and the architectural sophistication of what was produced reflects both the ambition of the Baghdad rulers and the quality of the Armenian architectural tradition that they were drawing on. Armenian architecture in the medieval period was one of the most distinctive and accomplished building traditions in the Christian world, with a long history of innovation in structural engineering and a rich vocabulary of carved ornamental decoration that had no close equivalent in the Byzantine or the Romanesque traditions developing simultaneously in the western and eastern parts of the Christian world. The Armenian architects who built the churches of Ani were working within a tradition that had been developing for centuries, a tradition that had already produced a series of extraordinary buildings across the Armenian highlands and the broader Caucasian region, and that at Ani reached its most ambitious and most fully realized expression. The social and cultural life of Ani at its height was characterized by the cosmopolitan diversity that is typical of major medieval trading cities. The city's position on the commercial routes between the Byzantine world to the west, the Islamic world to the south and east, and the Caucasian kingdoms to the north meant that it attracted merchants, craftspeople, and diplomats from a wide range of backgrounds, and the material culture of the city, as revealed by archaeological excavations, reflects the international connections of a place that was deeply embedded in the long-distance commercial networks of the medieval Near East. Armenian, Greek, Arabic, and Georgian were all languages heard in the bazaars and the churches of medieval Ani, and the architecture of the city reflects this cultural complexity, with its combination of specifically Armenian architectural forms, Byzantine influence visible in some of the decorative programs, and Islamic elements that entered the architectural vocabulary after the Seljuk period. The Cathedral of Ani is the most important single monument at the site, and understanding it is essential for understanding both what Ani was at its height and what the Armenian architectural tradition was trying to achieve in the period of the Baghdad Kingdom. The cathedral was begun under King Smbat II in the 980s and completed, or substantially completed, in 1001 under King Gagik I, by the architect Tredat, whose name is recorded in a surviving inscription and who is one of the few medieval architects anywhere in the world known to us by name and by specific credited works. Tredat was not simply the builder of the Ani Cathedral but one of the most accomplished architects of the medieval world, whose work includes the reconstruction of the Dome of the Hagia Sophia in Constantinople after its collapse in an earthquake in 989. A commission that indicates the degree to which Armenian architectural expertise was recognized and sought after beyond the borders of the Armenian kingdom itself. The cathedral is a large basilica with a central nave and two side aisles, covered originally by a timber roof whose evidence remains in the corbels and the vaulting springers that survive on the interior walls. The east end terminates in a polygonal apse, and the exterior of the building is articulated by the characteristic Armenian system of blind arcading, in which series of shallow blind arches run across the stone surfaces, creating a rhythmic pattern of light and shadow that is both structurally expressive and visually sophisticated. The stone used in the construction is the local volcanic tuff, worked with the precision that the Armenian stone carving tradition had developed over centuries, and the carved ornamental details of the capitals and the moldings and the decorative borders that frame the windows and the portal are among the finest examples of Armenian medieval decorative sculpture. The interior of the cathedral, which can be entered through the partially collapsed west facade, retains something of its original spatial quality despite the loss of the roof and the damage to the upper portions of the walls. The proportions of the nave, tall and relatively narrow by the standards of Western Romanesque architecture, create a sense of vertical aspiration that is characteristic of the Armenian architectural tradition, and the filtered light that enters through the remaining windows and through the gaps in the surviving masonry gives the interior a quality of atmospheric illumination that is, if anything, more evocative of the sacred character of the space than the more even illumination of a restored building would be. The damaged state of the cathedral is itself part of its historical significance. The building has been damaged repeatedly over the centuries, by the earthquakes that are a regular feature of this seismically active region, by deliberate destruction during military campaigns, and by the effects of 9 centuries of weathering in a harsh climate. The marks of this history are visible throughout the fabric of the building. Repairs in different stones from different periods, sections where the original carved detail has been lost to erosion while adjacent sections retain their precision, structural consolidations of different dates that reflect the efforts of different periods to maintain the building in a state that prevented complete collapse. Reading these marks, identifying the different phases of damage and repair and the different agents of deterioration, is one of the primary tasks of the architectural historians and conservation specialists who have been working at the site in recent years. The political history of Ani after the height of the Baghdad Kingdom is one of the most turbulent in the history of any major medieval city, and understanding the sequence of conquests and changes of rule that Ani experienced between the mid-11th century and the final abandonment in the 14th century is essential for understanding why the city is in the state it is today. The decisive event in the political history of Ani was the Seljuk conquest of 1064. The Seljuk Turks, who had emerged from the steppes of Central Asia to become the dominant military power of the Islamic world in the mid-11th century, had been expanding their territory across Anatolia and the Caucasus in the decades before 1064, and the conquest of Ani was part of this broader expansion. The Seljuk Sultan Alp Arslan, the same ruler who would defeat the Byzantine Emperor Romanos IV Diogenes at the Battle of Manzikert 7 years later in one of the most consequential military engagements of medieval history, personally led the campaign against Ani. The siege and conquest of the city was brief, lasting only a matter of days, and the sources describe the fall of the city in terms that emphasize both the military efficiency of the Seljuk assault and the catastrophic human cost to the population of Ani. The impact of the Seljuk conquest on the physical fabric of the city was significant but not total. Some of the city's churches were damaged or converted to other uses, and the population was substantially reduced by the violence of the conquest and the displacement that followed it. But the city continued to function as a significant urban center under Seljuk rule, and new construction, including the mosque that stands today as one of the most important surviving monuments of the site, was undertaken. The Mosque of Manakayr, built in the late 11th or early 12th century by or for the Seljuk governor of the city, is a remarkable building that reflects the synthesis of architectural traditions that characterized the Seljuk period at Ani. Its plan and some of its structural features are adapted from the Armenian tradition of the buildings it stands among, while its decorative program draws on the Islamic architectural vocabulary of the Seljuk world. The Georgian conquest of Ani in 1124 brought the city back under Christian rule, and the period of Georgian control, which lasted with interruptions until the Mongol invasions of the 13th century, was in many ways a period of renewed flourishing for the city. The Georgians undertook significant construction at the site, adding new churches and restoring others, and the commercial life of the city appears to have recovered substantially from the disruptions of the Seljuk conquest. The Church of the Redeemer, which stands today as one of the most dramatically ruined of Ani's monuments, its facade split vertically so that half the building has collapsed while the other half still stands, is a monument of the Georgian period, built by a Georgian nobleman in the early 12th century as a repository for a fragment of the True Cross. The Mongol invasions of the 13th century, which affected the entire region of the South Caucasus with devastating thoroughness, represent the second major catastrophe in Ani's post-Baghdad history. The Mongol forces that swept through the region in the 1220s and again in the 1240s destroyed or severely damaged many of the buildings that had been constructed or restored in the Georgian period, and the political and economic disruption of the Mongol period undermined the commercial foundations of the city in ways from which it never fully recovered. The population, which had been rebuilt after the Seljuk conquest, was reduced again, and the subsequent rulers of the city, a succession of smaller regional dynasties, lacked the resources and the political stability to restore Ani to its former importance. The architecture of Ani, considered across the full range of the monuments that survive in varying states of preservation, represents one of the most complete surviving examples of medieval Armenian architectural achievement, and its study has been central to the scholarly understanding of the Armenian architectural tradition more broadly. The Armenian architectural tradition in the medieval period was characterized by several distinctive features that set it apart from both the Byzantine tradition to the west and the Islamic traditions to the south and east, while also reflecting the influence of contact with both of those traditions. The use of the pointed arch, which appears at Ani in buildings dating from the 10th century, predates its appearance in the Gothic architecture of Western Europe by more than a century and may represent an independent development in the Armenian architectural tradition rather than an imported form. The development of elaborate stone vaulting systems, which allowed Armenian builders to cover large interior spaces with stone without the need for wooden roofs, is another area of structural innovation that the Armenian tradition pursued with particular energy and sophistication. The carved stone ornament that covers the surfaces of the major buildings at Ani is among the richest and most sophisticated decorative programs in the medieval world. The interlacing geometric patterns, the stylized plant forms, the figural scenes from scripture and from the lives of the saints, and the abstract ornamental systems that frame doorways and windows and articulate the surfaces of walls and apses. All of these are executed with a precision and a visual intelligence that reflect the work of carvers operating within a mature tradition with deep roots in the long history of stoneworking in the Armenian highlands. The relationship between the Armenian architectural tradition and the Byzantine tradition, which has been extensively debated by architectural historians, is visible at Ani in specific ways. The plan of the cathedral, with its basilican nave and its polygonal apse, reflects Byzantine influence in its basic organization, and the decorative programs of some of the carved ornament show awareness of Byzantine visual conventions. But the structural system of the building, the vaulting and the buttressing and the treatment of the exterior surfaces, is distinctively Armenian, reflecting the specific technical tradition that the builders of Ani brought to the commission rather than simply adopting Byzantine solutions to the structural problems that a large stone building presents. The Mosque of Manakayr at Ani is one of the oldest surviving mosques in the Caucasus and Anatolia, and its architectural character reflects the specific situation of the Seljuk period at Ani, a new ruling culture taking possession of a city whose physical fabric was entirely the product of a different architectural tradition and adapting that fabric to new purposes while also beginning to introduce elements of its own architectural vocabulary. The minaret of the mosque, which survives largely intact and which was one of the earliest surviving minarets in the region when it was built, is a finely crafted structure whose decorative brickwork reflects the Central Asian architectural tradition of the Seljuks, while its base is integrated into the stone fabric of the surrounding Armenian buildings in a way that speaks to the physical continuity of the urban landscape across the change of rule. The human geography of medieval Ani was shaped by the city's role as a commercial center at the junction of major trading routes, and the material evidence of the city's commercial life is one of the most important dimensions of the archaeological record at the site. The bazaars and caravanserais that served the commercial life of medieval Ani are among the less well-preserved elements of the site, since the commercial infrastructure of a medieval city was typically built in more perishable materials than the religious and administrative monuments, and the 9 centuries of deterioration since the abandonment have been more thorough in their work on the commercial buildings than on the churches. But the archaeological evidence for the commercial character of the city is substantial. The finds from excavations at the site include materials from a very wide range of origins, reflecting the international trading connections of a city that sat at the junction of routes linking the Byzantine world, the Islamic world, the Armenian highlands, and the Caucasian kingdoms. The cave city complex on the southern slopes of the ravine below the main plateau is one of the more unusual features of the Ani landscape, a network of cave dwellings and storage spaces cut into the soft volcanic tuff of the ravine walls that was used for habitation and commercial storage, probably throughout the period of the city's active occupation. These cave spaces, some of them quite extensive, provided additional living and working space that supplemented the built environment of the plateau above, and their relatively sheltered position in the ravine gave them a more stable microclimate than the exposed plateau surface, making them particularly suitable for the storage of goods that required protection from the extremes of temperature and humidity that characterize the plateau climate. The water supply of the city, which was an essential infrastructure for any urban settlement at this altitude and in this climate, was provided by a combination of wells, cisterns, and channels that drew on the springs and the water table of the plateau. The management of water resources was one of the standard engineering challenges of medieval urban planning, and the evidence from Ani suggests that the Baghdad builders paid careful attention to this challenge, incorporating water management infrastructure into the design of the city from its earliest phases of development as a capital. The population of medieval Ani was ethnically diverse in ways that reflected the city's position at the meeting point of several major cultural traditions. The Armenian population, which formed the dominant group in the Baghdad period, was supplemented by significant communities of Greeks, Georgians, Armenians from other parts of the highland region, and a variety of Muslim merchants and officials from the Islamic world. After the Seljuk conquest, the Muslim population grew substantially, and the Georgian period brought an additional influx of Georgian merchants and officials. The multi-religious character of the city, with its Armenian and Greek Christian churches, its mosque, and probably smaller places of worship for other religious communities, was not unusual for a major medieval commercial city, but was particularly pronounced at Ani given the specific position of the city at the intersection of the Christian and Islamic worlds. The final abandonment of Ani and the process by which the city passed from functioning urban center to empty ruin is one of the most complex aspects of its history, and the evidence for the timeline and the causes of that abandonment is still incomplete. The traditional account of Ani's abandonment places decisive weight on the earthquake of 1319, which is described in the medieval sources as having caused catastrophic damage to the city and as having essentially ended its life as a functioning urban settlement. This account is consistent with the physical evidence at the site, where earthquake damage is visible throughout the architectural fabric of the surviving monuments, and with the general historical context of the 14th century, when the broader region was experiencing a series of severe disruptions. But the abandonment of a major city is rarely the result of a single event, and the scholarship of recent decades has been working toward a more nuanced understanding of the process that reduced Ani from a city of tens of thousands of inhabitants to an empty plateau. The commercial decline of Ani, which began in earnest with the disruption of the trading routes that had been its economic foundation during the Mongol period, was probably the most fundamental cause of its eventual abandonment. The city's prosperity had always depended on its position on the routes that connected the major commercial centers of the medieval Near East, and when those routes were disrupted and reorganized in ways that bypassed the Armenian highlands, the economic foundations of the city were undermined in ways that could not be compensated for by local agricultural production alone. The loss of population that accompanied the commercial decline reduced the human resources available to maintain the built infrastructure of the city, accelerating the physical deterioration that the earthquake damage had begun. The political fragmentation of the South Caucasus in the post-Mongol period further complicated the situation. The small regional dynasties that successively controlled Ani after the Mongol period lacked the political stability and the resources to maintain the urban infrastructure that a major city required, and the city contracted gradually as the maintaining institutions, the churches, the markets, the administrative apparatus, ceased to function. By the time the Kara-Koyunlu Turkoman Confederation took control of the region in the early 15th century, Ani was already substantially depopulated, and the remaining inhabitants appear to have relocated to the more defensible and more economically viable settlements in the surrounding region. The physical evidence of the abandonment process is visible in the archaeological record in ways that allow at least a partial reconstruction of the sequence. The evidence for continued habitation in the cave complexes of the ravine walls later than in the buildings on the plateau surface suggests that the city contracted from the plateau into the more sheltered and more easily maintained cave dwellings as the population declined and the resources for maintaining the surface buildings diminished. The stratigraphic evidence from excavations in different parts of the site shows considerable variation in the date of the last occupation layers, consistent with a gradual contraction rather than a sudden abandonment. The rediscovery of Ani by the scholarly world in the modern period began in the 19th century, and the subsequent history of the site's investigation and management has been shaped by the complex political history of the region and the specific difficulties that arise when a major archaeological site sits on the border between two states with a deeply troubled relationship. The first systematic scholarly investigation of the ruins of Ani was conducted by the Russian archaeologist Nikolai Mar between 1892 and 1917, a period during which the region was under Russian imperial control following the Russian conquest of the Caucasus in the 19th century. Mar's excavations, which continued for more than 2 decades and produced an extensive documentary record of the site, established the basic framework of understanding of Ani's architectural and historical significance that subsequent scholarship has built on and refined. The Mar archives, which include extensive photographic documentation and architectural drawings of buildings and details that have since deteriorated significantly, remain an essential resource for anyone studying the site. The political changes that followed the First World War transformed the situation of Ani profoundly. The collapse of the Russian Empire, the establishment of the Republic of Turkey in 1923, the genocide of the Armenian population of eastern Anatolia that occurred between 1915 and 1923, and the establishment of the Soviet Republic of Armenia across the border. All of these events combined to make Ani one of the most politically sensitive archaeological sites in the world. The ruins sat in Turkish territory but had been the capital of an Armenian kingdom and were intimately associated with Armenian historical and cultural identity. The Soviet Armenian Republic across the border could see the ruins from its territory but had no access to them. Turkish policy toward the site during much of the 20th century was characterized by neglect rather than active development, reflecting both the limited resources available for archaeological work in this remote region and the political sensitivity of a site so closely associated with Armenian history. The situation began to change significantly in the early 21st century, when Turkey's increasing engagement with its UNESCO World Heritage portfolio and the growing international attention to the site brought new resources and a new institutional commitment to its investigation and preservation. The inscription of Ani on the UNESCO World Heritage List in 2016 formalized this new engagement and established an international framework for the site's management that has somewhat moderated the purely national political considerations that had previously dominated decisions about the site. The current archaeological work at Ani, conducted by Turkish universities in collaboration with international partners, represents the most systematic and most scientifically sophisticated investigation of the site since the Mar excavations. The application of modern archaeological methods, including geophysical survey, stratigraphic excavation, and the scientific analysis of finds, to the questions that Mar's pioneering work identified, is producing new understanding of the site's development and its history that significantly refines and in some cases revises the picture established by the earlier work. The parallel development of conservation work, aimed at stabilizing the most endangered structures against further deterioration, is addressing the urgent physical needs of a site that has been deteriorating for 9 centuries without systematic intervention. The experience of visiting Ani today is unlike that of any other major medieval archaeological site in the world, shaped by the combination of the physical grandeur of the surviving monuments, the stark emptiness of the plateau landscape, and the specific political and cultural significance that the site carries for Armenian people and communities. The approach to the site from the Turkish town of Kars, which is the nearest significant urban center, crosses a plateau landscape of extraordinary openness, the flat grasslands of the Anatolian highlands stretching in every direction under a sky that seems larger than the sky of most landscapes. The ruins become visible from a distance as a line of walls and towers on the horizon, their warm orange-red stone standing out against the green of the plateau grass in summer or the white of the snow in winter. As the approach continues and the scale of the walls and the individual monuments becomes clearer, the sense of encountering something genuinely extraordinary begins to build in a way that is different from the experience of most famous ancient sites, where familiarity from photographs and from cultural representations tends to reduce the impact of the first encounter with the physical reality. At the main entrance, passing through the city gate, the visitor enters a landscape that is defined equally by what is present and what is absent. The standing walls and the surviving churches and the great ruined bulk of the cathedral create reference points in a spatial experience that would have been defined, in the medieval city, by the density of streets and markets and residential buildings that no longer exist. The open plateau surface between the monuments, scattered with the foundations and the low walls of vanished structures, gives a sense of a city that was once full and is now empty that is more powerful and more affecting than the standard archaeological site experience, where the completeness of excavation and the density of interpretation tend to fill the physical and imaginative spaces left by the absence of the original structures. The view from the walls into the gorge of the Akurian River, which now forms the border between Turkey and Armenia, is one of the most charged views in the entire landscape of the medieval world. On the far bank of the river, visible from the walls of Ani, is Armenia, the country whose people built this city, whose culture produced the architecture that still stands on this plateau, and whose relationship to the site is one of the most politically and emotionally complex in the entire world of cultural heritage management. The view across the border from the ruins of the Armenian capital to the territory of the modern Armenian state, separated by a gorge and by the political reality of a border that has been closed for decades, is an experience that connects the archaeological dimension of the site to its ongoing human and political significance in a way that few sites anywhere in the world can match. The experience of Ani as a heritage site is therefore inseparable from the experience of it as a political landscape, and visitors who come to the site with a thorough knowledge of the history are encountering something fundamentally different from those who come simply to look at medieval ruins. For the latter, Ani is an extraordinarily impressive archaeological site in a dramatic natural setting. For the former, it is all of that and also a place where the accumulated weight of medieval achievement, of catastrophic political violence, and of ongoing political conflict are simultaneously present in the landscape, making every stone and every empty arch part of a story that is not finished. The Armenian dimension of Ani's significance is one that cannot be understood without reference to the broader history of the Armenian people and their relationship to the lands and the monuments of their medieval past. The Armenians are one of the oldest continuously existing peoples in the world, with a history of habitation in the highlands of what is now eastern Turkey, Armenia, and the South Caucasus that stretches back more than 3,000 years. The Armenian language, which is an independent branch of the Indo-European family with no close relatives, and the Armenian alphabet, created in the 5th century of the Common Era as part of a deliberate program of cultural consolidation, are both markers of a cultural distinctiveness that has been maintained across many centuries of political disruption and foreign domination. The Armenian Apostolic Church, which claims descent from the earliest Christian mission to the region and which traces its founding to the apostles Thaddeus and Bartholomew, has been the central institution of Armenian cultural identity for most of the past 2 millennia. The loss of the Armenian homeland in eastern Anatolia, which occurred through the genocide of 1915 to 1923, during which the Ottoman government systematically killed and deported the Armenian population of the region, is the central catastrophe of modern Armenian history and one of the most debated events of the 20th century. The ruins of Ani, sitting on the Turkish side of the border with the modern Republic of Armenia, are among the most visible physical evidence of the Armenian civilization that once flourished in this region and that was destroyed or expelled in the early 20th century. For the Armenian diaspora, which is dispersed across the world following the genocide, and for the citizens of the Republic of Armenia, Ani represents a connection to a medieval past that is simultaneously magnificent in its achievements and tragic in its subsequent history. The political situation of Ani, in a region where the Turkish-Armenian border has been closed since 1993 due to Turkey's support for Azerbaijan in its conflict with Armenia over the Nagorno-Karabakh region, means that most Armenians cannot visit the ruins of their medieval capital directly. This impossibility of access adds another layer to the emotional and political charge that the site carries, making it simultaneously a symbol of historical achievement, a monument to historical loss, and a physical expression of a contemporary political conflict that has not been resolved. The scholarly study of Ani has been complicated by these political dimensions in ways that are not always fully visible in the published literature. Turkish scholarship on the site has sometimes minimized or avoided the specifically Armenian character of the major monuments, referring to the architecture as generically medieval or Anatolian rather than specifically Armenian. Armenian scholarship, produced from within a politically and emotionally engaged relationship to the material, has sometimes allowed the depth of that engagement to influence the interpretation of the evidence in ways that are not always helpful for objective historical understanding. The best scholarship on Ani, of which there is a significant and growing body, engages honestly with both the evidence and the complexity of the political context in which that evidence is being interpreted. The conservation challenges at Ani are among the most complex in the world of medieval heritage, reflecting the combination of the physical deterioration of the structures, the sensitivity of the political context, and the relative scarcity of resources that have been available for conservation work over most of the century since Mars' systematic investigation. The primary physical threat to the surviving structures at Ani is the deterioration of the mortar that binds the stone blocks of the walls and vaults. The mortar used in the construction of the medieval buildings was a lime-based material that was appropriate for the conditions of use in a maintained and inhabited building, but that has been degraded by 9 centuries of exposure to the freeze-thaw cycles of the plateau climate. As the mortar degrades, the joints between stone blocks open, allowing water to penetrate, which causes further degradation and creates the conditions for structural instability that eventually leads to collapse. The visible evidence of this process is present throughout the site. Sections of wall where the mortar has been entirely lost and the stone blocks are held in place only by their own weight and by the friction between adjacent stones. Sections of vault where the loss of mortar in key joints has created a risk of imminent collapse. The earthquake history of the region adds another dimension to the structural vulnerability of the surviving buildings. The South Caucasus is one of the most seismically active regions in the world, and the evidence of earthquake damage is visible throughout the fabric of the Ani monuments in the form of cracked and offset walls, collapsed vaults, and the characteristic diagonal crack patterns that indicate seismic stress. The most dramatic instance of earthquake damage at the site is the Church of the Redeemer, whose western facade split vertically at some point in the past, leaving one half of the cylindrical church standing while the other half collapsed into rubble. This visual demonstration of the effects of seismic activity is one of the most powerful images at the site and one of the most frequently photographed. The conservation work that has been carried out at Ani in recent decades, accelerated by the UNESCO inscription in 2016, has focused primarily on the stabilization of the most endangered structures through the remortaring of critical joints and the consolidation of loose masonry. This work, which is technically demanding and requires careful attention to the compatibility of conservation materials with the original fabric of the buildings, has had visible results in reducing the risk of imminent collapse at several of the major monuments. But the scale of the conservation challenge at a site of this extent and this complexity is such that the resources that have been applied to date represent only a fraction of what would be needed for a comprehensive conservation program. The question of reconstruction versus stabilization, a fundamental issue in the conservation of any archaeological site, is particularly complex at Ani given the political context. Reconstruction of significant portions of the surviving monuments, which would be necessary to give visitors a more complete impression of the original buildings, would inevitably involve interpretive choices about the original form of damaged or lost elements that would be influenced by the national and cultural perspectives of the conservators involved. The preference for stabilization rather than reconstruction that characterizes the current approach reflects both an appropriate conservatism about the limits of current knowledge and an awareness of the sensitivity of interpretive choices in a context where different communities have strong and competing investments in the appearance of the monuments. The broader significance of Ani in the history of medieval civilization is not limited to its importance as an Armenian monument, but extends to its place in the larger narrative of the medieval world and the specific position it occupied at the intersection of the Christian and Islamic civilizations of the middle centuries of the Common Era. The period of Ani's greatest flourishing, the late 10th and early 11th centuries, was a period of extraordinary cultural vitality across the entire medieval world. In Western Europe, the Romanesque architectural tradition was developing the forms and the structural innovations that would eventually lead to Gothic. In the Byzantine world, the Macedonian dynasty was presiding over a period of cultural and military revival. In the Islamic world, the Abbasid Caliphate was at the height of its cultural achievement in Baghdad, while the new Fatimid Caliphate was establishing itself in Cairo. And in the Armenian highlands, the Bagratid Kingdom was building a capital that incorporated elements from all of these surrounding traditions while maintaining a distinctively Armenian cultural identity. The architectural connections between Ani and the broader medieval world are real and important. The pointed arch that appears at Ani in the 10th century may have influenced the architectural traditions of the Crusader states in the Levant, which were established in the early 12th century in a region where Armenian builders and craftsmen were active. The structural innovations of the Armenian vaulting tradition may have contributed to the development of Gothic architecture in the 12th century, though the specific channels through which this influence might have been transmitted remain a matter of scholarly debate. What is clear is that the Armenian architectural tradition, of which Ani is the most complete surviving example, was not a provincial or peripheral development but a central contribution to the broader history of medieval architecture. The commercial significance of Ani within the medieval trading world adds another dimension to its historical importance. The city sat on routes that carried silk from China, spices from the Indian Ocean trade, and the luxury goods of the Islamic world to the markets of the Byzantine Empire and the Caucasian kingdoms. The commercial revenue that these routes generated was the economic foundation of the Baghdad kingdom's ability to invest in the monumental architecture that defines the site today, and the international character of the trading community that the city served is reflected in the cosmopolitan material culture of the archaeological record. Understanding Ani as a commercial center, not just as a religious and political capital, is essential for understanding the full range of its significance in the medieval world. The presence of Armenian merchants and craftsmen in the commercial networks of the medieval Near East extended far beyond the boundaries of the Baghdad kingdom, and the Armenian diaspora of the medieval period, which established trading communities in cities from Constantinople to Baghdad to Cairo to the cities of the Silk Road, was one of the more significant commercial networks in the medieval world. The specific skills of Armenian craftsmen, including their mastery of stone carving and their expertise in the production of textiles and metalwork, gave them a marketable identity in the cosmopolitan trading cities of the medieval Near East that was recognized and valued beyond the boundaries of any specific political entity. The wildlife and the natural landscape of the Ani Plateau, which have developed in the absence of human habitation over the 9 centuries since the city was abandoned, add a dimension to the experience of the site that is unexpected and in many ways moving. The plateau grass that covers the open spaces between the monuments supports a rich grassland ecosystem that has developed in the centuries of human absence. Wildflowers bloom between the ruins in spring and early summer, the same species that would have grown in the uncultivated margins of the medieval city, but now covering the entire surface of the plateau between the archaeological features. The birds that inhabit the ruins, nesting in the empty towers and the collapsed vaults of the churches, include several species of raptor that take advantage of the high vantage points provided by the standing walls, as well as the corvids, the jackdaws and the ravens, whose calls echo through the empty nave of the cathedral in ways that the medieval worshippers who gathered there would not have recognized. The foxes and other small mammals that have colonized the ruins are visible to visitors willing to wait quietly at the edges of the site in the early morning and late afternoon, and the wolves that inhabit the surrounding plateau landscape occasionally cross the archaeological zone in the colder months. The absence of human habitation has allowed these animals to develop a relationship to the ruins that is both ecologically interesting and visually powerful. The sight of a fox moving through the arch of a medieval doorway or resting in the shade of a 1,000-year-old wall is one of the images that visitors to Ani most frequently describe as defining the character of the site. The seasonal transformation of the landscape, from the snow-covered bleakness of winter to the vivid green of spring and the dry gold of late summer, gives the ruins a different character at different times of year that adds to the complexity of the experience. The winter, when the plateau is covered in snow and the ruins stand in stark relief against the white ground and the gray sky, is the season that most clearly communicates the harshness of the climate that has been working on the monuments for 9 centuries. The spring, when the wildflowers bloom between the ruins and the air has the freshness of a landscape newly emerged from winter, is the season that most clearly evokes the possibility that this place was once full of life. The view from the plateau across the Akurian Gorge to the Armenian mountains is one of the most dramatic natural views available from any archaeological site, and the quality of the light in this high-altitude landscape, clear and intense in a way that the lower and more humid landscapes of the Mediterranean world rarely achieve, gives the ruins and the surrounding landscape a visual intensity that photographs rarely fully capture. The combination of architectural and natural grandeur, the ruins of a great medieval city in a landscape of mountain and gorge and open sky, is what makes Ani one of the most visually powerful sites in the medieval world. The geological context of the site adds another layer to this visual experience. The volcanic rock that provided the building material for the medieval city is the same rock that forms the plateau and the surrounding landscape, and the visual continuity between the built environment of the ruins and the natural environment of the plateau gives the site a quality of organic connection to its landscape that is different from the experience of archaeological sites where the building materials were imported from elsewhere. The stone of the cathedral walls is the stone of the plateau itself, shaped by human hands but fundamentally continuous with the geological history of the place where it stands. The inscription program of the Ani monuments, the carved texts in Armenian, Arabic, Georgian, and Greek that survive on various buildings throughout the site, is one of the most important sources of historical information about the city and represents in itself one of the more remarkable documents of medieval cultural complexity. The Armenian inscriptions, which are the most numerous and the most historically informative, include dedicatory texts that record the names of the patrons who commissioned the buildings, the names of the architects who designed and built them, the dates of construction in the Armenian calendar, and sometimes more extensive historical information about the circumstances of the building's creation. The inscription on the cathedral that records the name of the architect Tridat is one of the most famous examples, but there are many others throughout the site that provide similarly specific historical data. Reading these inscriptions, which require specialized knowledge of medieval Armenian script and language, has been one of the primary scholarly tasks in the study of Ani, and the insights they provide into the social and institutional history of the city are irreplaceable. The Arabic inscriptions at the site, which date primarily from the Seljuk period and are concentrated on and around the Mosque of Manakayr, provide a different perspective on the history of the city. They record the names of Seljuk officials, the dates of construction and dedication of the mosque, and religious texts that document the specifically Islamic character of the Seljuk engagement with the city. The contrast between the Armenian inscriptions on the surrounding buildings, which invoke the names of Christian saints and record donations to Christian institutions, and the Arabic inscriptions on the mosque, which invoke God in the Islamic formula and record the acts of Muslim officials, is a physical expression of the cultural complexity of a city that had been transformed by conquest while retaining much of the physical fabric of its predecessor civilization. The Georgian inscriptions, dating from the period of Georgian control in the 12th and early 13th centuries, add a third voice to this multilingual historical record. The Georgians were Christians of a tradition closely related to but distinct from the Armenian, and their presence at Ani is documented not only by the inscriptions but by architectural additions and modifications to existing buildings that reflect the Georgian architectural tradition alongside the Armenian one that produced the major monuments. The Church of the Redeemer, the most dramatically ruined of the major Ani churches, carries Georgian inscriptions that document its construction under Georgian patronage while its architectural form is fundamentally Armenian. The multilingual character of the Ani inscription corpus is itself a document of the medieval world's approach to cultural diversity. In an age before the nationalist ideologies that would make linguistic and cultural uniformity a political goal, major cities were routinely multi-ethnic and multilingual, and the physical fabric of those cities carried inscriptions in multiple languages as a matter of course. The walls and the churches of Ani recorded in stone the successive communities that had inhabited and used and transformed the city, each leaving a textual mark in their own language that coexists in the surviving fabric of the site with the marks left by those who came before and after them. The comparison between Ani and other great medieval cities that have been lost to history or that survive only in ruined form is instructive for understanding what was distinctive about the Ani experience and what it shares with the broader pattern of medieval urban rise and decline. Baghdad, the Abbasid capital, was at roughly the same period as Ani's greatest flourishing one of the largest and most sophisticated cities in the world, with a population that may have reached 1 million people, a concentration of scholarly and literary and artistic achievement that was unmatched anywhere in the medieval world, and a commercial and administrative infrastructure of extraordinary complexity. Baghdad was destroyed by the Mongols in 1258 in one of the most catastrophic events of the medieval period, and the physical fabric of the medieval city has been almost entirely obliterated by the subsequent history of the site. Of the great Abbasid capital, Almost nothing survives in the landscape of modern Baghdad. Ani presents a different kind of survival. The medieval city was not destroyed in a single catastrophic event but declined gradually over several centuries, and the stone buildings that expressed its greatest ambitions have survived in varying states of ruin, in a landscape that was too remote and too marginally productive to attract the intensive subsequent occupation that has buried or demolished the physical fabric of most medieval cities in more productive and more accessible regions. The accident of location and geology that preserved the ruins of Ani, giving them time to become ruins rather than being demolished for building material or buried under later construction, is the same accident that makes the site so evocative and so historically significant today. The comparison with Constantinople, the great Byzantine capital that Ani's builders were certainly aware of and to some extent trying to rival, is also instructive. Constantinople survived the medieval period and continues to exist as Istanbul, one of the great cities of the modern world. But the survival of the city has come at the cost of the obliteration or transformation of most of its medieval fabric. The great Byzantine monuments, the Hagia Sophia, the Hippodrome, the land walls, survive as isolated monuments in a modern city of 15 million people, stripped of the urban context that gave them meaning. Ani, by contrast, sits in a landscape that preserves something of its medieval character precisely because it has not been a functioning city for 9 centuries. The ruins are ruins, not restored monuments or museum pieces, and the experience of encountering them in this unrestored state is one that few major medieval sites anywhere in the world can offer. The category of the medieval ruin, the large-scale monumental building that has been abandoned and damaged but not destroyed, and that retains enough of its original structure to communicate its architectural ambition while showing clearly the marks of its subsequent history, is one of the most emotionally powerful in the repertoire of historical experience. The ruin combines presence and absence in a proportion that speaks directly to the experience of time and of loss, and the medieval ruins that carry the most powerful charge of this kind are those where the relationship between the original ambition of the builders and the subsequent reality of decay and abandonment is most clearly and most dramatically expressed. Ani, with its cathedral open to the sky and its city walls containing an empty plateau, is one of the most fully realized examples of this category. The sound of Ani, or rather the particular quality of the silence that characterizes the plateau in the absence of the city that once filled it, is one of the most immediate and most affecting aspects of the experience of the site. Medieval cities were not silent places. They were full of the sounds of human activity, the voices of merchants in the bazaars, the sound of craftsmen at work in their workshops, the bells of the churches marking the hours of the liturgical day, the calls of the muezzin from the minaret of the mosque, the sounds of animals in the streets, the noise of construction and the creaking of the laden carts that brought goods to and from the markets. The Ani of the 10th and 11th centuries, at the height of its prosperity, would have been one of the noisiest places in the medieval Near East. A city of perhaps 100,000 people, a major commercial center, a political capital, a place of several functioning religious communities, all generating the sounds of their activities simultaneously in the relatively confined space of the walled plateau. What remains of all this noise at Ani today is nothing. The plateau is silent in the way that only a genuinely empty landscape can be silent, with none of the ambient background noise of human activity that characterizes even the quietest modern urban environment. What sounds exist at the site are the sounds of the natural world. The wind, which is a constant presence on this exposed plateau and which produces its own set of sounds as it moves through the empty buildings and across the openings of the ruined vaults, the birds, whose calls carry clearly in the still air, and the occasional distant sound of traffic on the road that approaches the site from the Turkish town of Kars. The acoustic character of the surviving buildings adds another dimension to this sonic landscape. The cathedral nave, open to the sky through the gaps in its deteriorated upper walls and roof, has an acoustic quality that is quite different from the sealed interior of a functioning building, but that is not simply an absence of acoustic character. The stone surfaces reflect and diffuse sound in ways that create subtle reverberation effects, and the experience of hearing the wind or one's own voice in this space has a quality of resonance that is not merely physical but is charged with the awareness of what the space once was and what it was built to do. The silence of Ani is the silence of a city that has been empty for 9 centuries, and it is a silence that is felt as a presence rather than simply as an absence. It is the accumulated silence of all the voices and all the sounds that once filled this place and that have left no physical trace in the surviving stones. The stones themselves are not silent. They carry in their surfaces the marks of the hands that shaped them and the centuries that have weathered them, and reading those marks is one of the primary ways in which the history of the city can be recovered. But the living sound of the city, the irreducible evidence of human presence and human activity, is gone completely and irrecoverably, and the silence that has replaced it is one of the most powerful aspects of the experience of standing in this extraordinary place. The question of Ani's future, both as a physical site requiring conservation and as a cultural and political symbol carrying significance for multiple communities with competing claims to its heritage, is one of the most complex in the contemporary world of heritage management. The physical future of the site depends primarily on the resources committed to its conservation, the quality of the conservation decisions made with those resources, and the continuation of the political will that led to the UNESCO inscription and the accelerated conservation work of recent years. The structures that currently survive at Ani are in very different states of stability. Some of the major monuments are relatively stable and in the medium term face no immediate risk of catastrophic failure, while others are in a state of acute vulnerability where a significant seismic event or an exceptionally severe winter could trigger collapse. The prioritization of conservation resources, the identification of which structures are most urgently in need of intervention and which can be monitored without immediate treatment, is one of the central challenges of the current management of the site. The political future of the site is inseparable from the broader political relationship between Turkey and Armenia, which has been defined by the unresolved legacy of the genocide, by the closure of the border, and by the competing national narratives about the history of Eastern Anatolia that the two countries maintain. The possibility of a rapprochement between Turkey and Armenia, which has been discussed and partially negotiated at various points in the recent past without reaching a definitive outcome, would transform the situation of Ani by opening the site to Armenian visitors and by creating the conditions for a more collaborative approach to its management. The absence of such a rapprochement leaves the site in the politically anomalous position of being simultaneously the most important surviving monument of Armenian medieval civilization and a site to which most Armenians cannot travel. The role of international heritage institutions, primarily UNESCO but also other organizations engaged with the preservation of cultural heritage in conflict-affected and politically sensitive contexts, in managing the Ani situation has been significant but necessarily limited. UNESCO can provide resources, technical assistance, and international visibility, and the World Heritage Inscription has done all three for Ani. But the fundamental political questions that surround the site, the unresolved history of the Armenian genocide, the closed border, the competing national claims to the heritage of the region, are not questions that UNESCO or any other heritage institution has the authority or the capacity to resolve. They are questions for the states involved and for the communities with the most direct stake in their resolution. The experience of managing heritage sites in politically divided landscapes has produced a body of practice and principle across the world that is relevant to the Ani situation. Sites like Nicosia in Cyprus, divided between Greek and Turkish communities, and the archaeological sites of the Korean demilitarized zone, accessible to neither side of the political division, offer partial analogies that illuminate both the specific challenges of the Ani situation and the kinds of solutions that have proved workable in comparable contexts elsewhere. The specific combination of factors at Ani, the closed border, the unresolved genocide question, the UNESCO inscription, and the growing international recognition of the site, creates a context in which progress toward a more equitable and more collaborative management arrangement is possible but not inevitable. The legacy of Ani in the broader history of Armenian civilization and its meaning for the Armenian people today is one of the most complex dimensions of the site's significance, and it is one that requires careful engagement with both the historical evidence and the contemporary political context. For Armenian people, both in the Republic of Armenia and in the diaspora communities scattered across the world following the genocide, Ani represents a connection to a medieval past that is simultaneously a source of pride and a symbol of loss. The cathedral, the churches, the walls that still stand on the plateau above the Akurian Gorge. These are the physical embodiments of a civilization that was, for several centuries, one of the most sophisticated in the medieval world, and their survival, even in ruin form, provides a tangible connection to that civilization that is not available through texts and manuscripts alone. The sight of the ruins from the Armenian side of the border, which is possible for Armenian citizens who approach the gorge, is one of the most charged visual experiences available in the contemporary landscape of the Armenian world. The role of Ani in Armenian cultural production, in literature and in visual art and in film and in music, reflects the depth and the complexity of this emotional relationship. Armenian writers and artists have returned repeatedly to the image of the ruined city as a symbol of the loss that defines much of the modern Armenian experience, using the physical grandeur of the ruins and the circumstances of their abandonment and their inaccessibility to express something essential about the specific character of Armenian historical experience. This cultural production is not simply nostalgic or elegiac, but often analytically sophisticated, engaging with the historical complexity of Ani's rise and fall in ways that go beyond simple lamentation. The scholarly engagement of Armenian historians and archaeologists with Ani is another dimension of this relationship that deserves recognition. The Armenian contribution to the study of Ani, both in the Soviet period when Armenian scholars at the Institute of Archaeology in Yerevan produced important research on the site, and in the post-independence period when the scope and the international character of that research has expanded significantly, has been central to the development of the scholarly understanding of the site. The specific expertise that Armenian scholars bring to the study of medieval Armenian architecture and epigraphy, an expertise grounded in a tradition of scholarship that has been developing for more than a century, is irreplaceable for the understanding of the site, and the conditions that have limited the access of Armenian scholars to the site itself have been one of the most significant constraints on the development of that understanding. The situation is beginning to change, slowly and imperfectly, as the international attention brought to Ani by the UNESCO inscription has created new incentives for collaboration between Turkish and Armenian scholarly institutions. The publication of joint research, the sharing of archival materials, and the participation of Armenian scholars in international conferences on the archaeology and conservation of the site are all developments of recent years that would have been inconceivable in earlier decades. These developments do not resolve the political questions that surround the site, but they represent a form of scholarly engagement across the political divide that is both valuable in itself and potentially a model for the broader political relationship between the two countries. The silence of Ani is not the silence of a natural landscape that has never been inhabited. It is the silence of a place that was once full and is now empty, and the difference between these two kinds of silence is one of the most immediately felt aspects of the experience of the site. A natural landscape that has never been inhabited has a silence that is purely natural, the silence of the wind and the birds and the small sounds of an ecosystem going about its business without reference to any human past. The silence of Ani carries something else. The weight of the human presence that was here and is no longer here, the awareness that this specific silence is the result of a specific history that produced the ruins that surround it. The empty cathedral nave, the collapsed arches of buildings whose walls still stand to a height of several meters, the long curved line of the city walls with their empty towers. All of these things speak of human intention, human ambition, human achievement, and their silence is therefore not a natural silence but a historical one, the silence of things that were built to be inhabited and used and heard and are now none of those things. The specific character of the Ani silence is shaped by the specific character of the site's history. This is not the silence of a place that was gradually depopulated as its economic fortunes declined and its population drifted away to more prosperous locations, leaving behind only the poorest and the most immobile of its inhabitants. It is the silence of a place that experienced violence and catastrophe alongside gradual decline, a place whose emptying was accelerated by conquest and earthquake and the deliberate disruption of the trading networks on which its economy depended. The quality of the silence carries, for those who know the history, something of the specific character of the events that produced it. This historical silence has been working on the monuments for 900 years, and in that time it has become part of what they are. The ruins of Ani are not simply damaged versions of the buildings that once stood here. They are something new, something that did not exist before the abandonment and that has been created by the specific process of deterioration and survival that 9 centuries of emptiness has produced. The way the light falls through the gaps in the walls that were once windows, the way the grass grows through the joints in the stone of the plateau surface, the way the wind sounds in the empty nave of the cathedral. These are the aesthetic characteristics of a ruin, not of a building, and the experience they offer is different in kind from what any restored or reconstructed version of the medieval city could offer. The people who will come to Ani in the decades and centuries ahead will find a site that is still changing, still being shaped by the ongoing processes of structural deterioration and natural succession that have been at work since the last inhabitants left. The conservation work that is underway will slow some of these processes and prevent some of the most catastrophic losses, but it will not stop them entirely, and the Ani of 100 years from now will be different from the Ani of today in ways that are not fully predictable. What can be predicted is that the site will continue to be one of the most significant and most affecting medieval ruins in the world, a place where the achievement and the loss of a great civilization are simultaneously and permanently present in the landscape. Standing at the edge of the city walls of Ani, looking out across the Equirrian Gorge to the mountains of Armenia in the late afternoon light, the full weight of the site's significance becomes available in a way that is available nowhere else. The gorge below is deep and green, the river catching the late light at the bottom of the ravine. On the far bank, the landscape of Armenia rises in terraced fields, and then forests, and then the bare rock of the mountains against a sky that is beginning to turn toward the colors of evening. The border between Turkey and Armenia runs along the bottom of the gorge, invisible from above but present in every sense that matters, politically, culturally, historically, emotionally. The view across this border, from the ruins of the Armenian capital to the territory of the modern Armenian state, is one that no photograph fully captures and no description fully communicates, because its significance is not simply visual but is composed of everything that is known about the history of the city behind you and the history of the people whose ancestors built it. Behind you on the plateau, the cathedral stands against the evening sky, its surviving walls and the outline of its damaged nave still communicating the architectural ambition that produced it more than 1,000 years ago. The Church of St. Gregory of the Tigranids, the best preserved of the major Ani churches, catches the last direct sunlight on its carved exterior surfaces, the warm stone of the decorative arcading glowing in a way that gives some sense of what the polychrome surfaces of the medieval city must have looked like when they were new and all of the buildings were complete and the city was full of the people who had built it and who lived and worked and worshipped in it. The wind moves across the plateau as it has moved across it for 9 centuries of emptiness, indifferent to the significance of what it passes through. The birds settle into the towers for the night. The last visitors begin to move toward the exit. And the ruins of Ani, which have been here since the medieval world ended and the modern world began, settle into the darkness of another night on a plateau that was once the most important city in the Armenian world and is now one of the most important ruins in the medieval world, which is a different kind of importance but not a lesser one. If this film has kept you company through the night, consider subscribing so you never miss the next quiet journey. And if you are ready for another story from the ancient world, there is one waiting for you on the screen now.